The moon had no name. It had a number, MK7 on the Vicara survey grid, but nobody called it that either. It was just the gray moon, the dead one, the one with the mineral deposits that were almost valuable enough to bother with, and the research outpost that was almost comfortable enough to live in, and the permanent smell of cold stone that never quite left your clothes. Cathara had been stationed there for 14 months. They catalogued atmospheric particulates. They ran soil samples through 3 different spectrometers. They filed reports that were read by nobody, and stored in archives that would likely outlast the species that built them. It was the kind of work that made you forget there was a war happening 4 systems over. That was, Cathara had decided, probably the point. The pod hit the surface just after the second shift. Cathara heard it before they saw it. A sound like something very expensive being destroyed very fast. A shriek of metal against rock, and then a long grinding slide that ended with a noise that meant the hull had cracked. They stood at the outpost window and watched a trail of gray dust settle across the plain. The pod was small, emergency class, venting atmosphere from a crack along the port side, which meant whoever was inside had somewhere between 40 minutes and 2 hours before the inside became the same temperature as the outside. The outside was 40 below. Cathara ran 3 probability calculations. Political exposure of rendering aid to an unknown vessel, high. Probability that the vessel's occupant was Makara, low. Wrong type of pod, wrong markings. Probability that the vessel's occupant would die without intervention, near certain. They pulled on their outer suit. The hatch was jammed from the impact. Cathara pried it open with a rock sample bar, the kind of tool that was meant for sediment cores and not for this, and the hatch gave with a sound like a bad joint, and swung wide. The creature inside was human. Cathara knew humans the way most species knew humans, by report. Bipedal, 2 eyes, disturbingly soft exterior for something so persistent. This one was young, which on a human was hard to tell, but the face had not yet settled into itself, and the eyes, when they opened, had that unfocused quality of someone whose body had been spending all its available energy on staying alive, and had left very little for anything else. He had burns on his left arm and his right side. His uniform was 3rd Terran Expeditionary. His name tag said, Mensa. He looked at Cathara. Cathara looked at him. He said something in a language Cathara's translator took 3 seconds to process, and what it produced was, "Am I dead?" "No," Cathara said. He closed his eyes. They carried him inside. His name was Dio. He was 23 years old. He had been separated from his unit during the Makara sweep through the Kessian corridor, a sweep that had, by the reports Cathara had been carefully not reading, killed most of the 3rd Expeditionary's forward units in 6 days. He had gotten to a pod. He had not known where the pod was going. He had just known he needed to be somewhere else. The somewhere else had been MK7. Cathara treated his burns with the outpost's medical kit, which was designed for Vicara physiology, but was adaptable enough for something close to carbon-based. They gave him food, which he ate with the focused desperation of someone who had been counting meals. They gave him water. They let him sleep for 18 hours in the spare equipment room, on a mat that was sized wrong for him, but was warm. They did not record his name in the station log. They did not tell the other outpost staff. There were 3 others, a geological surveyor, a systems technician, and a junior researcher, who was 20 years old and cried when things were hard. Cathara decided that the fewer people held the information, the smaller the surface for it to bleed from. He was there for 11 days. On the 6th day, a Mahara inspection cruiser dropped out of FTL at the edge of the system. Cathara told Dio to get into the mineral sample crate, the large one, B-17, 3 meters by 1.5, currently holding core samples from the eastern ridge. He looked at the crate. He looked at Cathara. He got in. Cathara moved the core samples around him, leaving gaps for air. They sealed the crate. They went back to their workstation and began filing the atmospheric particulate report they had been putting off for 2 weeks. And when the Mahara inspection team came through the outpost with their scanners and their flat bureaucratic questions, Kathara answered everything in the careful, slightly bored voice of a researcher who had nothing to hide, because there was nothing here worth hiding. The inspection team left. Kathara waited 1 full hour. Then they opened the crate. Dio sat up, covered in rock dust, and took a long breath. "Okay," he said. "Yes," Kathara said. On the 11th day, Kathara gave him the comms relay. It was one of the outpost's secondary units, small enough to fit in a pocket, with enough range to reach Terran-accessible frequencies in neutral space. They gave him the flight coordinates too, a vector that would keep him out of the Mahara patrol routes, and bring him to the neutral corridor in 4 days at the pod's remaining fuel capacity. Dio stood at the outpost door in his patch suit, holding the relay and the coordinates. He looked at Kathara the way humans looked at things they did not have words for yet. "Why?" he said. Kathara did not answer immediately. The answer was not. Kathara had a sibling once, at the Mahara processing stations. This was not why they helped. Kathara was almost certain of this. "Go," Kathara said, "before the patrol window closes." He went. 3 days later, the Mahara inspection cruiser returned. The passive scan from its first pass had caught trace biological residue. Not Vekara, not anything registered in the station's occupancy log. The tribunal order came through the same morning. The outpost was to be sanctioned. The staff were to be taken for questioning. Kathara was flagged specifically. Collaborator, Terran-aligned, pending formal review. Kathara stood on the gray plain and watched the 3 Mahara ships descend through the thin atmosphere. The dust moved in long, slow waves around the landing struts. The cold was the same cold it always was. It had no interest in the moment. Kathara thought about the look on Dio's face when he understood he was going to live. That face, that specific face, with the dust on it, and the exhaustion, and the thing underneath the exhaustion, that was something Kathara did not have a clean word for. It was enough. The Mahara soldiers came across the plain, and Kathara did not run and did not speak, and let them put the restraints on. And the gray moon kept being gray all around them, indifferent and permanent, and utterly unchanged by any of it. Corporal Deo Mensa arrived at Terran Forward Station 11 on a Thursday. He was thin, in the way that 4 days on emergency rations makes a person thin. Not dramatically, not the kind of thin that makes people stop and stare. Just the kind that makes your uniform sit wrong, and your face look like it belongs to someone older. The medical team cleared him in 40 minutes. The burns on his arm and side were mostly healed. The kind of mostly that would leave marks, but not problems. He ate in the medical bay. He slept for 11 hours. On Friday morning, they sat him down for his debrief. The officer across the table was Lieutenant Cook. She had done 314 debriefs in 9 years of this war. She knew the shape of them: unit, sector, engagement, casualties, survival mechanism, any intelligence gathered on Makara positions or weapons or patterns. She typed while people talked. She had learned not to look up too often. Looking up made it harder. Deo gave her everything in order: name, rank, unit, the corridor engagement, the names of the people in his unit who didn't make it to pods. He gave those names slowly, and she typed them slowly, and neither of them said anything about what they were. Just names going into a system that would send letters to families who were already afraid. Then he stopped. He looked at the table for a moment. "There's one more thing," he said. He told her about Kathara. He told her the species name, the outpost location, the moon's survey designation. He told her about the burns being treated, and the 11 days, and the crate of rock samples, and the comms relay, and the coordinates. He told her all of it, in the same flat, careful voice he'd used for everything else, and then he stopped again. "They didn't ask for anything," he said. "I want that in the report. They didn't ask me for anything at all." Lieutenant Cook had stopped typing. She looked up. She read back what she'd written, added his last statement, verbatim, and closed the file. She thanked him for his service in the way she always thanked people, which was sincerely but quickly, because there were other things that needed doing. Dio Mensa left. She sat alone in the debriefing room. She read the file again. Then she walked it to her captain herself, instead of sending it through the system. The document moved. This is what it did and how it moved. The captain read it, and pulled up the Vicara political file, and read it, and then called the sector commander. The sector commander read it and went quiet, and said he'd handle it from here. He didn't handle it. He walked it to the general. The general's name was Holt. She had been running the Kessian corridor engagement for 2 years. She had gray hair and a reputation for being unmovable, and a habit of standing at windows when she was thinking, which her aide had learned to recognize as a signal to leave the room. The aide left the room. General Holt stood at the window for 7 minutes. Then she sent the file to Terran Strategic Command with a single line attached. For Admiral Osei, personal review requested. Commander Yara Osei read the file once. She sat at her desk in Terran Strategic Command, a room that was all function and no comfort, screens on 3 walls, a desk that looked like it had been bolted to the floor, because someone decided the room didn't need anything that could be moved. She read the file once, from the unit designation at the top, to "they didn't ask me for anything at all," at the bottom. She set the document down. 6 minutes passed. Her aide, a young man named Patel, who had been at this post for 8 months, and had learned several things about Admiral Osei, later described those 6 minutes as the quietest he had ever heard the command center. Not because people stopped talking. They didn't. They kept working, kept moving, kept doing all the things that a war required people to do without stopping. But the quality of the quiet that came from Osei's desk was different. It had weight to it. It spread. By minute 4, people were speaking slightly softer. By minute 6, 2 separate conversations had simply stopped mid-sentence, for reasons neither participant could explain. "Get me fleet disposition for the Kessian corridor," Osei said. Patel had the file open before she finished the sentence. "Admiral, the Vicara aren't our allies. Formally there. Get me fleet disposition." He got her fleet disposition. Ambassador Vel of the Quorum species was not supposed to be monitoring Terran Strategic Command communications. The Quorum's charter as the galaxy's closest institution to a neutral diplomatic body was clear on this point. They observed. They did not intercept. They were very careful about the distinction, and they maintained it consistently in all cases except when they felt that a situation had the potential to significantly alter the political balance of the settled systems, at which point they became somewhat more flexible about what observing included. Vel had been watching Terran communications more closely since the Kessian corridor started. A war of that scale, between a power the size of the Makara Empire and something as unpredictable as humanity, required close watching. Vel had 17 years of diplomatic experience and had been present at the end of 4 interstellar conflicts. They knew what a war's shape looked like when it was changing. They saw the fleet orders go out. They saw the scale. 41 vessels, battle class, moving on a vector that intersected Vicara space, specifically the sector containing MK7 and its gray moon and its sanctioned outpost. Vel sat very still at their monitoring station. They pulled the attached intelligence. They read the debrief file, which they were definitely not supposed to have access to. They read it twice. Then they opened a channel to the Quorum emergency relay and sent a communique to 37 species simultaneously. The message was 4 lines. The last line was, "Mobilization classification unknown, scale total. We recommend immediate assessment of all outstanding interactions with Terran personnel, hostile or cooperative, within the last standard cycle." The word total sat in 37 inboxes across the settled systems. Most of them read it once and called an emergency session. 3 of them read it, and quietly, without telling anyone, began reviewing their records of how their border patrols had treated human ships in the last 2 years. They did not like what they found. They started making changes before morning. The Vicara had a word that translated roughly as the silence before a thing that is too large to look at directly. It was an old word, originally used for eclipses, for the moment when the light goes wrong, and the animals stop moving, and the air changes in a way that is difficult to explain, but impossible to miss. The junior aide at the Vakara government's observation station used that word when the Terran fleet dropped out of FTL, at the edge of the system. She counted the ships. She counted them again. She put down her counting tool and said the words softly, to no one. 41 vessels came out of jump, in perfect formation. The kind of formation that took either a very long time to learn, or a very serious reason to maintain. They were not firing. They were not broadcasting threats. They were moving at a calm, steady burn toward the inner system, and the calmness of it was somehow worse than if they had come in weapons hot and screaming. Behind the warships, 3 vessels that were clearly not warships. No weapons configurations, wide cargo bays. The kind of ships that carried things meant to be used after a fight, not during one. The aide reported the count to her supervisor. Her supervisor reported it to the government. The government held an emergency session that lasted 6 hours and produced no conclusions except that they needed more time for another emergency session. The Makara garrison in the sector had 11 ships. Captain Drool, commanding officer of the garrison, received the intelligence about the incoming Terran fleet and did what any competent military commander would do. She assessed the numbers, assessed the vector, and sent an emergency request to High Executor Droon for either reinforcements or authorization to negotiate. She got neither, in time. Droon was in the middle of his own emergency session. He stood at the center of the command chamber on the Makara primary station, which was a large room built to make the person standing at its center feel powerful. He was looking at the projection of the Terran fleet's approach vector and asking his intelligence corps the same question in 17 different ways, because the first 16 answers had not satisfied him. What do they want? Executor, our models. What do they want? The intelligence officer, a careful, precise creature named Velsan, who had been running political models for the Makara High Command for 11 years, pulled up her analysis and delivered it in the flattest voice she could manage, because the flat voice was the one she used when the content was uncomfortable. The fleet's approach vector is consistent with a single objective, she said. The secondary processing facility on the Gray Moon, MK7. The Vakara station, yes, they want the Vakara station. They want the prisoners held at the Vakara station, Executor. Our models suggest, she paused, one prisoner specifically. The xenobiologist, Cathara. Droon looked at the projection. 41 ships, moving like they had already decided how this ended, and were just waiting for the space between now and then to pass. For one prisoner. One xenobiologist who fed a human and hid him in a box. Run the models again, Droon said. We have run them 31 times, Executor. Run them again. Cathara did not know any of this. The processing facility on the Moon's secondary station was not a place designed to inform its occupants of current events. It was designed to hold them, process their documentation, and wait for the tribunal's schedule to open up. The cells were cold in the way that facilities like this were always cold. Not punishingly, not deliberately, just indifferently, as though warmth had been considered and set aside as an unnecessary expense. Cathara sat on the cell bench with their knees drawn up, and thought about particulate samples. It was the most useful thing they could think of. The atmospheric data from the eastern ridge had been showing anomalous results in the sulfur band for 3 months, and Cathara had a hypothesis about subsurface venting that they had never had time to fully develop. They developed it now. They went through the numbers carefully, step by step, because the numbers were there, and they were not. And that was a kind of work that the cell could not take from them. The other outpost staff were in adjacent cells. The young researcher cried sometimes. Cathara said her name through the wall when it got very bad. Just her name, nothing else, and it seemed to help a small amount. They had been here 9 days. They did not know that 9 days ago, a document had reached a desk in Terran Strategic Command. They did not know about the 6 minutes of quiet, or the fleet orders, or the word total sitting in 37 inboxes across the settled systems. They thought about subsurface venting, and waited. The Vakara government sent a diplomat to meet Osei's ship. The diplomat's name was Oren Vass. They were experienced, polished, the kind of diplomat who had navigated 6 separate interstellar crises, and come out of all of them with the situation improved and their own government's position intact. They boarded the Terran command vessel with a prepared statement, and a list of concessions, and a carefully structured argument for why the situation could be resolved through formal channels. Osei received them in a meeting room that had no decorations, no refreshments, and chairs that were built for function rather than comfort. Oren Vass delivered the first section of their prepared statement. The part about the Vakara government's non-involvement in the Makara's sanction decision, the part about formal apologies, the part about, "We're not here for you," Osei said. Oren Vass stopped. "The Vakara government has 2 options," Osei said. Her voice was the same temperature as the room. "Stand aside, or stand in the way." That's the whole list. Admiral, the political implications of a Terran military engagement in Vakara space without governmental— "Let's be plain about this," Osei said. "We are going to that facility. We are bringing back our people. We are going to do both of those things regardless of what this conversation produces. If you want to be standing on the right side of what happens next, go back to your government and get your ships out of the approach corridor." Oren Vass left. The ships moved. The junior aide at the observation station watched the Terran fleet burn toward the gray moon. She stood at the wide observation window, and she could not look away from it, because there was something about the sight that the word eclipse did not quite cover, though it was closer than anything else she had. 41 ships, for 1 prisoner. Moving like they had all the time in the galaxy, and also like they were not going to stop for anything. She said it to the supervisor who came to stand beside her. "They came for 1, she said. "They brought 41 ships for 1. The supervisor watched the formation for a long time. "Make a record of this," he said finally. The battle started at 0400 station time, and lasted 43 minutes. The Makara garrison fought. This is worth saying clearly, because some accounts of that engagement later made it sound like the Makara simply fell apart at the sight of the numbers, and that was not true. Captain Drool and her 11 ships knew the system. They knew its gravity wells, and its sensor shadows, and the 2 dense mineral belts that scrambled targeting systems if you flew through them at the right angle. They used all of it. 2 Terran vessels took significant damage in the first 10 minutes. 1 took damage that would keep it in dry dock for 4 months. The humans were not untouchable, they bled. But there was something off about the way the Terran fleet fought, and Drool could feel it from the first exchange, and could not name it until the 18th minute, when it finally came clear. They were not angry. In Drool's experience, fleets fought one of 2 ways: cold and calculated, like a machine running a program, or hot and reckless, like something that had been pushed past the point of clean decision-making. The Terran fleet was neither. It was patient in a way that was not the same as cold calculation. Patient like something that had been waiting a long time, and was finally here, and did not need to rush, because it had already decided how it ended. It looked like grief, with a ship attached to it. Drool had no tactical response for that. The manuals did not cover it. On every ship in the Terran fleet, the crew knew the story. Not the mission briefing, the story. Corporal Deo Mensa, 3rd Terran Expeditionary, 23 years old, burns on his arm. A Vakara scientist, who asked him nothing, gave him everything, and put him in a box of rocks, so a Makara inspection team would not find him. It had moved through the fleet the way that certain stories move, not through official channels, not through announcements, just person to person, in mess halls and in corridors and in the quiet moments before a jump. Until by the time the fleet dropped out of FTL at the Gray Moon, there was not a crew member on any of those 41 ships who did not know it. They were not fighting with rage. Rage was a thing that burned fast and left ash. What they were carrying was older and slower. The thing that made them build memorials to people they had never met. The thing that made them remember names that history had no reason to keep. The kind of feeling that does not diminish with time, but collects and compresses and becomes something very hard. They carried it at 0400, and they carried it through all 43 minutes, and they were still carrying it when it ended. At the 26th minute, a Makara captain opened a negotiation channel. Captain Drool had authorized it. She was not a creature who gave up easily, but she was also not a creature who continued doing things that were not working simply because stopping felt like loss. The numbers were the numbers. She offered what she had to offer. Territorial concession in the outer Kessian sector. Mineral extraction rights on 2 moons that were actually worth something. A formal apology from the Makara High Command for the sweep and burn operation that had destroyed the 3rd Expeditionary's forward units. She transmitted the offer to the Terran command vessel, and waited. Oze listened to the full transmission. She sat in her command chair with the same stillness she'd had for the last half hour, listening, and when it was done, she was quiet for a moment. "Let's be plain about this," she said. The channel was open. She knew Drool could hear her. She did not lower her voice. "You don't have anything we want." She closed the channel. The engagement continued. At minute 43, the Makara garrison broke. Not all at once. 2 ships fought until their drives failed. But the rest pulled back to a holding distance that was technically not retreat, and Captain Drool stopped transmitting, and the battle was functionally over. The rapid insertion team breached the secondary processing facility 17 minutes after the garrison broke. There were 6 of them. They were not the kind of soldiers who appeared in recruitment posters. No dramatic armor, no cinematic intensity. They were methodical people in functional gear who moved through the facility corridors like they had done this many times and were not interested in making it more complicated than it needed to be. They had the facility schematic. They had the cell block location. They moved. The guards at the cell block made 2 decisions, resist and then do not resist, in very rapid sequence, and then they were on the floor and the team was past them. Cell 12. The team leader's name was Sergeant Adeza Okeki. She had been in the Terran Special Operations Unit for 6 years. She had done 11 extractions. She had a habit of removing her helmet at the point of contact, not for tactical reasons, just because she had decided at some point that the people she was pulling out of places deserved to see a human face first, and not a visor. She removed her helmet. Keth Ara was sitting on the cell bench with their knees drawn up. 9 days of cold and indifferent food and the sound of the young researcher crying through the wall had left marks on them, in a way that kind of time always leaves marks. Not dramatic, not visible, just present, in the way they held themselves and the careful flatness of their expression. They looked at Sergeant Okeke. Okeke looked at Keth Ara. "Corporal Mensa sends his regards," she said. Keth Ara was very still for a moment. The translator processed their response and produced, "I do not understand what is happening." "Yeah," Okeke said. "Nobody does, really. Let's go." They went. The other outpost staff came too. The young researcher stopped crying somewhere in the 3rd corridor, and by the time they reached the extraction point, she was moving at a run, which was, Okeke thought, a good sign. High Executor Droon received the final report from the garrison at 0511. He stood in the command chamber, where the projection of the Terran fleet still hung in the air, and he read the report, and he was quiet for a long time. Velsan stood at her station and did not speak. She had learned not to speak during the long quiet periods. "They got what they came for?" Droon asked. "The xenobiologist is aboard a Terran medical vessel," Velsan said. "The fleet is beginning to pull back." "To where?" "They are not leaving the system, Executor. The warships are pulling to a holding distance. The 3 non-combat vessels are moving toward the Vakara outpost." A pause. "They appear to be beginning repair operations on the outpost's infrastructure." Droon looked at her. "They are repairing the outpost?" "Yes, Executor." "After a military engagement?" "Yes." The Terran fleet, 41 ships, 3 of which were now in a slow approach, to a Vicara research station they had just fought a battle to reach, and were beginning to repair. He had fought 17 species in his career. He had never fought something that brought doctors to the place it had just destroyed. He stood in the command chamber and looked at the projection for a long time, and the thing he was feeling was not a thing he had a Makara word for. But if he had borrowed a word from another language, the word would have been dread. Not because of the ships, because of what the ships meant about the creatures inside them. The warships did not leave. They moved to a holding position at the system's edge, far enough to be clearly non-threatening, close enough to be clearly present. It was a specific kind of message. Not aggressive, not departing. Just there. Steady. In the way that certain things are steady, not because they were built to be, but because they have decided to be. The 3 non-combat vessels moved to the Grey Moon. They brought engineers. The engineers looked at the outpost's structural damage, which predated the Makara sanctions by several months, and began fixing it. Not just the arrest-related damage, all of it. The heating conduit that had been running at 60% efficiency. The water reclamation unit with the fractured seal. The atmospheric processor that made a sound like a bad knee in cold weather. They fixed it all with the focused, slightly irritated energy of people who looked at broken things and found them personally offensive. They also brought a food production console, a medical team, and a cargo bay full of supplies that the Vicara outpost system had not stocked in 2 years because the budget had been cut 3 times, and nobody in the government had prioritized a mineral research station on a dead moon in an unimportant system. The Vicara government watched all of this and could not locate it in any framework they had. They sent Oren Vass again, the diplomat who had been in the meeting with Osei. It was, perhaps, not the most strategic choice. Oren Vass had not left that meeting feeling confident about the outcome, but they were available, and experienced, and willing. They boarded the Terran command vessel a second time. Osei received them in the same room, with the same chairs. "We are grateful for the rescue of the outpost staff," Oren Vass said. "We want to discuss terms of—" "There are no terms," Osei said. Oren Vass stopped. "Someone helped one of ours," Osei said. "We pay our debts." "I see. And the construction work? The medical teams? The supplies?" "We pay our debts," she said again. The repetition was not carelessness. Oren Vass understood after a moment that it was the entirety of the explanation. Not a policy, not a negotiating position, just a fact about what humans did, stated twice, so that there was no confusion. Oren Vass went back to the government. The government held another emergency session. This one produced a conclusion. Do not interfere with the humans. Let them repair what they want to repair. Do not ask them what it costs, because they will say the same thing twice, and it will be unsettling. Deo Mensa had been flown out. His commanding officer had decided, without formal authorization, on her own judgment, that he had earned the right to be there. She had put him on the first available shuttle to the medical vessel, and written a note in the file that said, "Compassionate Transport," and did not explain further. Nobody asked her to. He found Kethara in the medical bay on the 4th deck. The room was warm. It smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, which was the smell of human ships, and Kethara had been cataloging the smell carefully for 2 days the way they cataloged everything, storing it as data. Deo stood in the doorway. Kethara looked at him. He had filled out since the Grey Moon. The burns were healed. He was still thin, but differently thin, the kind of thin that is almost healthy, that is a week away from being just fine. He was wearing a Terran uniform that fit him properly. He came in and sat in the chair across from the bed, and they looked at each other in the way of 2 creatures who share an experience that has no existing name. The translator sat between them. "I did not think anyone would know," Kethara said. Deo nodded. "We know," he said. "I did not do it for—" "I know," he said. The room was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that needs filling. The kind that has arrived at something and is sitting with it. Kethara looked at the food tray beside the bed. Something warm. The Terran medical team had researched Vicara dietary requirements, with the specific intensity that humans applied to problems they cared about, which was the same intensity they applied to all problems, which was too much, always too much. Your people are very strange, Cathara said. Yeah, Deo said. I don't mean it badly. I know. He stayed for 2 hours. They talked about the particulate research, because Cathara brought it up, and it turned out that Deo had an uncle who was a geologist, and so he knew what subsurface venting was, and had opinions about the sulfur band data that were wrong in interesting ways. They argued about it in the mild, focused manner of 2 people who have survived the same thing, and need somewhere to put the energy that comes after surviving. When he left, neither of them said anything final. He stood up and nodded and walked out. Cathara looked at the empty chair for a while. Ambassador Vel of the Quorum presented their formal analysis to the 47 Species Council 6 weeks after the engagement. The report was 40 pages. The first 39 covered logistics, fleet specifications, timeline of events, and political ramifications for the Vicara-Makara-Terran Triangle. The 40th page was the conclusion. Vel read it aloud, because several council members had requested it, and because Vel felt it was the kind of conclusion that was better heard than read silently. The room was very quiet by the end of it. The key paragraph said, "Humanity does not mobilize for territory or resources or ideology in the conventional sense. They mobilize for debts. The mechanism appears to function identically whether the debt is a wound or a kindness. An injury to one of theirs produces a military response. An act of compassion toward one of theirs produces a military response, a reconstruction operation, and what can only be described as a permanent, protective interest in the benefactor. There is no mechanism for opting out of either outcome. If you harm a human, you acquire humanity as an enemy. If you help a human, you acquire humanity as something that has no clean diplomatic classification, and is significantly more durable than an ally." Vel paused. "We recommend all species govern themselves accordingly." The galaxy recalibrated. Not publicly, not with announcements, but in the months that followed, things shifted in the small, quiet ways that real shifts happened. Species that had been careless with Terran prisoners of war began revising their protocols. The revisions were not announced as policy changes. They were filed as administrative updates, routine reviews, adjustments to existing frameworks. The language was bureaucratic. The reason behind it was not. Species that had been quietly kind to stranded Terran explorers, given food, given directions, once in the case of a Pelhari merchant vessel given a working engine part for free, found that their shipping routes through Terran-adjacent space had become notably smoother. Trade licensing moved faster. Port fees were somehow always correct. Nobody from the Terran side called this policy either. Nobody had to. Droon held one final briefing for his senior captains. They sat in the command chamber where the projection of the Terran fleet had hung for 2 weeks before he finally had it taken down. The room felt large without it. He asked for recommendations on protocol for future Terran encounters. Captain Drool, who had fought the engagement and survived it, and came away with the specific wisdom that comes from being on the losing side of something you studied and still didn't understand, spoke first. "Don't touch their people," she said. Droon looked at her. "And if we're at war with them?" another captain asked. "If engagement is unavoidable?" Drool was quiet for a moment. "Don't touch their people," she said again. "Don't touch anyone who has touched their people. Don't touch anyone who has been kind to their people. Don't touch anyone in the same system as anyone who has ever looked at one of their people and decided to help." She paused. "The safe option is to simply not be in a position where any of those decisions become relevant." The room was quiet. Droon looked at the space where the projection used to be. "Write that up," he said. "Word for word. Send it to every garrison commander in the sector. Somewhere in neutral space, in a Terran medical bay on the 4th deck of a ship that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, Keth Ara was eating something warm. They were thinking about the word that did not exist yet. Not in Vakara. Not in any language they knew. The word for what they were to these creatures, and what these creatures were to them, and what the 11 days, and the box of rocks, and the warm food, and the 2 hours of arguing about sulfur band data had made between them. It was not ally. It was not friend. It was not debt, though debt was in it somewhere. It was something that did not have a shape yet, because it was still too new. Cathara had been looking for that word for 6 weeks. They suspected the humans had been looking for it longer. They suspected this was not the last time one of each of them would end up on the same ship, arguing about geology, not saying the thing that didn't have a word yet. They suspected that was all right. They finished the food. They looked at the ceiling. The ship moved through the quiet dark, carrying everyone home.